When I was growing up and first started playing football, it seemed like everyone wanted to be a centre forward. It was the most hallowed position on the pitch, and often the preserve of the best player in the team. The striker scored most of the goals and took most of the plaudits. It was like being the frontman in a band. Sure, a lot of the hard work might have been done by those standing behind you, but ultimately, no one has posters of the bass player or of the drummer up in their bedroom wall. Whilst I don't play much football with children now, because that would be odd, I suspect that is no longer the case. Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo, the latter of whom does now play almost as a traditional centre-forward, but both of whom played their best football not as strikers, whilst still scoring the most goals and being the two best players in the world, changed that landscape. For the first time in the history of the sport, the two most prolific players in all of world football weren't centre-forwards. Of course, that is just two players, you might quite reasonably point out. But the rise of Messi and Ronaldo is indicative of a larger shift that has taken place within the sport. The death of the centre-forward position. Poachers were the first to go, roughly a decade ago. Their death knell sounded when Pipo Inzaghi hung up his boots in 2012. Meanwhile, Javier Hernandez's downfall at the top level of the sport hammered the final nails into the poacher's coffin. You could argue that we ought to have known what was next. Liverpool, Manchester City, and PSG, three of the best teams in world football, all have very different styles and approaches to games, but are united in their lack of an out-and-out centre-forward. Even Chelsea, when they lifted the Champions League last season, did so with Timo Werner playing in quite an abstract forward role, with both Kai Havertz and Mason Mount frequently occupying more advanced positions, the former of whom would score the winning goal in that game. Meanwhile, their opponents Manchester City didn't even have the pretense of a centre-forward out on the field of play, with Kevin De Bruyne, the club's most advanced player in a central position, and Riyad Mahrez and Raheem Sterling the biggest threats on either flank. It's difficult not to notice this shift within the game, and whilst this video isn't an obituary to centre-forwards, or a declaration of their extinction, I wouldn't even put them on the critically endangered list just yet, there are still plenty of them around, I do think it is a trend which has received very little attention, despite being among the most consequential developments within the sport over the last 10 to 15 years. So in today's video, I'm taking a deep dive into why centre-forwards, at least at the highest level, have become a dying breed, who is responsible, and whether this is a trend that is likely to continue until strikers are consigned to the history books along with halfbacks and traditional fullbacks, or whether it is merely cyclical, and that the pendulum will eventually swing the opposite way at some point, perhaps even in the imminent future. When Spain won the European Championships in 2012, battering Italy 4-0 in the most comfortable Euros final win of all time, to become the first European team to ever win 3 successive major tournaments, their lack of a centre-forward was very apparent. Whilst David Villa's goals have been key to Spain's successes in both 2008 and in 2010, as either the top scorer or joint top scorer at both of those two tournaments, a fractured tibia ruled him out of the finals in Austria and Switzerland. Vicente Del Bosque still took Fernando Torres, Alvaro Negredo, and Fernando Llorente to the tournament, but with none of them in blistering form at the highest level, and a plethora of extraordinarily talented midfielders at his disposal, Del Bosque didn't play any of them. Instead, he played 6 midfielders, 3 of them being what we might call number 10s. Cesc Fabregas was often the most advanced of the Spanish midfielders, with David Silva and Andres Iniesta also providing significant goal threat. The reason Spain's lack of strikers seems so distinctive and has lasted so long in our minds is because it had very rarely been done before. But as I alluded to in the introduction, neither team really had a centre-forward in the 2021 Champions League final either, yet no one even batted an eyelid when those two team sheets were announced. The idea for this video came when someone tweeted me about Mason Greenwood saying that he ought to be playing as a number 9 because his movement and finishing are so good. And I couldn't help but think, but why? Sure, years ago, that would have seemed like his natural progression, gradually increasing his output in front of goal until Manchester United trusted him to be their main man through the middle and to go and get 20 to 25 goals a season. But now, the best goal scorer, with the best movement in the Premier League at this moment in time, is Mohamed Salah, who operates off the right flank. Few players have scored more goals in the Premier League over the last 4 or 5 years than Raheem Sterling, who has some of the best attacking movement that I've ever seen and typically plays off the left flank. Elsewhere, you have Sadio Mane, as well as Salah at Liverpool, Son Heung-min at Spurs, Mikel Oyarzabal at Real Sociedad, and Vinicius Jr. at Real Madrid, all among the top scorers in their respective leagues. Manchester United's own top scorer, Greenwood's club, hasn't been a centre-forward once in any of the past 3 seasons. That is not to say that I don't think Mason Greenwood should be tried out in a central role, or that he couldn't flourish there. He very well could. But clearly, it isn't as straightforward as saying, great movement, sharp eye for goal, therefore he has to be a central striker anymore. The game has moved on. In the mid-2000s, every top team had a top centre-forward, and plenty of lesser teams outside of that top bracket also had some very good ones. The game was littered with them. Henry, Eto'o, Klose, Drogba, Luca Toni, David Villa, Rooney, Shevchenko, Torres, Ibrahimovic, Forlan, Mackay, Owen, Ronaldo, Trezeguet, Van Nistelrooy, Van Persie. The list just goes on and on. You couldn't dream of reeling off a list of centre-forwards like that now. Not because, as some have claimed, footballers have just got worse over the last 10 to 15 years, but because the expectation of them, the way in which they are coached, and the way in which the game is played has changed. Just take Liverpool, as perhaps the most illustrative example. Last season, Roberto Firmino, Liverpool's most central forward, wasn't even among their top 3 highest scorers, and there is every chance that will be the same again this season. In 48 games, Firmino scored 9 goals, following 12 in 52 the previous season and 16 in 48 the season before that. That covers 3 seasons in which Liverpool won both the Champions League and the Premier League, and Firmino played as many games as almost anyone during that time, so clearly Jurgen Klopp was happy with what he was doing, despite his lack of goals. Firmino's role at Liverpool is almost a distinct one, functioning as a playmaker both on and off the ball. Not only does the Brazilian frequently provide for Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane, and more recently Diogo Jota at times through his vision, awareness, and weight of pass, but actually, primarily, it is through his work rate and his ability to win the ball back high up the pitch. Early on in his time at Liverpool, I remember Jurgen Klopp saying that no playmaker in the world is as good as an effective counter-press. That is to say, whilst a great playmaker might be able to unlock a defence fairly frequently, if you can win the ball back high up the pitch, when the opposition don't have as many players back defending, you are likely to create an immediate opening and a chance on goal. We have seen this from Liverpool and Firmino countless times, and it is a type of forward, very distinct from a traditional striker, that is fairly new to the game, and fairly unique, though, again, it is representative of a broader trend. The general direction of travel in football in recent years has been an increased reliance on players' physical attributes and their ability to contribute to the totality of a game. I mentioned this briefly in my video about the decline in flair players during this similar 10 to 20 year period, and fewer players in every position are being allowed to get away with having very singular and defined roles on a football pitch. Goalkeepers are now expected to be comfortable with the ball at their feet and capable of picking passes rather than just routinely hoofing the ball downfield. Centre-backs are expected to be ball players capable of kick-starting attacks. Full-backs are being asked to provide a team's width and creativity. Wingers have become many teams' primary goal scorers. We are seeing this happen all over the park, and strikers are no exception. Few teams will tolerate a big static centre forward these days, even if they are incredibly effective within the 6-yard box. They want athletes who are involved in a game from start to finish, both off and on the ball, and all of these things are intertwined. The fact that goalkeepers and centre-backs are expected to be better with the ball at their feet and are less prone to simple hit-and-hope 50 or 60-yard long balls, at least at the highest level, means that there is less of a need for a focal point in attack, either playing with their back to goal and holding the ball up, or looking to get the ball in behind. And as the output of wide players increases, the reliance on centre-forwards to score goals has declined. Pep Guardiola's approach to the game is very different to Jurgen Klopp's, but he too has shown a real aversion to traditional centre-forwards. He practically forced Samuel Eto'o out of Barcelona a year after Eto'o scored 36 goals in a season and Barca won the treble. He swapped him for Zlatan Ibrahimovic, plus cash, who lasted just a single season, before being forced out due to Pep's preference for playing Lionel Messi through the middle, who isn't a traditional centre-forward by any means. Eto'o and Ibrahimovic are two of the most talented and lethal strikers of the past 20 years, but they didn't fit in to what Pep wanted to do, so out they went. The idea of a team voluntarily getting rid of a striker who just scored 36 goals in a previous generation would have seemed unthinkable. Guardiola threatened to make it 3 world-class centre-forwards upon his arrival at Manchester City, when there was plenty of talk of him selling Sergio Aguero following his first season in charge. Aguero, it was reported, didn't contribute enough off the ball or in Manchester City's build-up play to justify his starting berth, despite scoring 33 goals in 45 games and having the best goals per minute record in the entire division. Aguero managed to successfully alter his game, becoming more physical, more industrious, and more constructive. Aguero therefore became a pivotal player in Pep's project at Manchester City, but only because he did exactly what was asked of him. Had he been just a bit more stubborn, I have little doubt that Guardiola would have made it 3 from 3. Even someone like Harry Kane, who is without doubt one of the most sharp-eyed and talented centre-forwards on the planet, has been retrained from scoring 40 goals in a season as an old-school number 9 and being likened to Alan Shearer, to playing virtually as a number 10 and even deeper at times, and creating as many goals as he scores. Of course, part of that is due to specific circumstances at Tottenham, and other clubs, coaches, and perhaps injury circumstances might not have resulted in that exact outcome. But again, it is part of a broader trend. Many centre-backs mourn the days in which they were expected to, quote, do a job on a centre-forward, keeping tight to them, not letting them turn, and trying to prevent them from cleanly receiving the ball. The vast majority of centre-forwards will now drop deep on a regular basis to get involved in the build-up as midfield runners and wide players drift into those positions. It makes the old concept of man marking virtually impossible and potentially disastrous. And it is noticeable that when a young centre-back does come up against an out-and-out centre-forward, they are sometimes not quite sure how to combat it, because it is so new to them. I think we saw a pretty good example of that when Romelu Lukaku enjoyed a field day for Chelsea upon his return up against a very youthful Arsenal backline. Even in the case of Lukaku though, who is a tremendous centre-forward and is now Chelsea's record signing, there are times this season against certain types of opposition when they might be more effective as a unit without him. It is worth noting that when Chelsea tore Norwich City to shreds 7-0 last weekend, they did so without a single centre-forward on the pitch, as both of their fullbacks scored and Mason Mount bagged a hat-trick. You could hardly imagine a better case study of how you no longer need a traditional centre-forward than that. Whilst there are still some brilliant young centre-forwards emerging within the game, Erling Haaland being the most obvious example, they are becoming less and less common. Speak to anyone who works at a top-flight football club, and particularly within their academy system, and you'll soon discover why. English football was later to the party than most on this front, but in recent years there has been a radical shift in emphasis towards ball skills, interplay, and teamwork within elite-level academies. The result of this has been very evident in the more technically gifted players that English football has produced, whether that be Phil Foden, Jadon Sancho, or Jack Grealish, and that has been rightly celebrated. However, there are also examples of extremely talented young goal scorers, cold-blooded goal-getters, being coached out of those goal-scoring instincts in favour of a one-size-fits-all approach. Anyone who has been in and around youth team football will be familiar with cries of "don't be greedy." But being greedy was once the proviso of all great centre-forwards. Gerd Muller was greedy. Eusebio was greedy. Ruud van Nistelrooy was certainly greedy. As I said during the introduction, this isn't an obituary. There are still many fine centre-forwards in football. Robert Lewandowski, chief among them, and Karim Benzema, whilst not an out-and-out centre-forward, not too far behind. So a centre-forward can certainly be integrated into a great team, even one that plays a style contrasting to their own. Just look at Sebastian Haller's transformation at Ajax, where he has scored 12 goals in 13 games in a permanently ball-playing side, if you wish to find evidence of that. But the overall direction of travel, as I say, is unambiguous. Whether it will be permanent or temporary still remains to be seen. Right now, it appears to be a well-defined long-term trend, and with the catalyst for it, whether that be the reduced reliance on centre-forwards for goals or youth team coaching, all crystallising, you could be forgiven for thinking that the death of the centre-forward is inevitable at some stage. But football has a funny way of seeming destined to go in one direction before a sudden change of course. In the late 1990s and early to mid-2000s, a very defensive, counter-attacking style took hold of the game. Not conceding was seen as the prerogative, and hitting teams on the break the best way to punish them, and people thought that would prove to be the most effective way of winning forevermore. Then came Barcelona in Spain with their tiki-taka style of possession-based football, starving their opponents of the ball and carefully crafting attacks until an opportunity presented itself. Everyone wanted to emulate it. Tiki-taka was the future, and many academies began to mandate that style. But then came the Germans, and Bayern Munich, with their teams packed full of energy and purpose, pressing teams high up the pitch, winning the ball, and getting shots on goal. Direct, powerful, and purposeful. A game changer. That is sort of where we are at now, with those two philosophies variously intertwined and coexisting. But the future is unknown. There will be further tactical innovations and, even more likely, reinventions as old ideas are reintroduced for the modern era. The inside forward, which virtually every team had two of in the 1950s, all but disappeared upon the birth of the 4-2-4 and later the 4-4-2 formations at the end of that decade, which became almost universal as the 1960s rolled on. Decades later, though, the inside forward returned. No longer called that, often misidentified as being a winger or a right or left-sided attacking midfielder, particularly in the 4-2-3-1 formation that took hold a decade ago, and became the dominant system among elite-level teams for a number of years. It is quite possible that, at some point, even the rarest of modern-day centre-forwards like poachers or target men could be reintroduced. Not because history simply repeats itself, but because as the game continues to evolve, old ideas become useful again and are picked up to serve a certain purpose, or to combat a new prevailing style. Ultimately, it will come down to whether centre-forwards are able to adapt to the modern game, because there is no doubt that they will have to. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram, I would highly recommend it, via the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.